The year is 2084. Elias stands at the edge of the Nebraska Heritage Zone, where the asphalt ends and the silence of the new world begins. Behind him, the engine of the truck idles with a heavy, rhythmic thrum. The vibration travels up through the soles of his boots and settles deep into his marrow. It is a raw, mechanical pulse that feels like a heartbeat in a graveyard. He keeps his grip tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the dark material. To his left, the horizon stretches out, flat and empty, under a sky stripped of all noise. He shifts the transmission into first gear, the sound of metal clicking against metal sharp and intrusive in the heavy air. The machine shudders in response, a guttural growl that defies the stillness of the plains. Elias stares down the long, cracked ribbon of road ahead. He does not look back at the quiet expanse he is leaving behind. He takes a breath, feels the heat radiating from the dashboard, and prepares to move. The road is waiting, and for now, the path still belongs to him. Elias released the clutch, and the truck lurched forward. He pulled onto the interstate, the heavy tread of his tires biting into the pavement with a rhythmic slap that felt like an insult to the smooth surface. Almost immediately, a silver pod slid past him in the adjacent lane. It moved at exactly 120 miles per hour without a single shudder or deviation. There was no sound of an engine, no hint of combustion, only the faint, high-pitched whine of magnetic drive. It glided like a needle through silk. Elias gripped the wheel harder as the turbulence from the pod hit his door, forcing him to steer into the resistance. He corrected his path, his muscles tensing to hold the line against the invisible wake. On the highway, there were no traffic lights, no stop signs, and no human hesitation. Everything flowed in a perfect, synchronized swarm managed by a central grid that calculated distance to the millimeter. To the automated systems, he was an anomaly, a jitter in the data stream. He pushed the throttle, feeling the heat rise from the floorboards, desperate to maintain his own momentum against the eerie, frictionless efficiency of the world surrounding him. A silver pod drifted into the lane beside him, matching his speed with surgical precision. It did not swerve or accelerate to pass, but hovered there, a silent observer in the flow of traffic. Elias glanced over, his grip on the wheel firm. Inside the pod, a child sat pressed against the glass, eyes wide and fixed on the vibrating truck. The child raised a hand, pointing a finger at the steering wheel in Elias's hands. There was no recognition in that stare, only a profound, hollow confusion. To that child, the sight of a human hand guiding a vehicle was as foreign as a relic from a dead civilization. Elias held the gaze for a heartbeat, seeing his own existence reflected in the child's bewilderment. He was a ghost from a century that had been erased. The child turned away, losing interest as the pod accelerated with a sudden, silent surge, vanishing into the stream of perfect motion. Elias remained alone, the engine's roar suddenly feeling louder, more intrusive, and entirely out of place in the sterile expanse of the highway. He felt the weight of the machine under his control, a heavy, defiant anchor in a world that had forgotten how to steer. The silence of the highway felt heavier now, pressing against the windshield like a physical weight. Elias tightened his grip, his fingers locked around the worn rim of the steering wheel, his knuckles turning stark white against the dark material. He felt the cold vibration of the column, a direct line of communication between his pulse and the steel beneath him. He was tired of being an anomaly to be observed. He needed to be a force that was felt. He shifted his weight, bracing his back against the seat, and reached for the gear stick. The metal was cool and unyielding. He pulled it back, a deliberate, forceful motion that engaged the transmission with a loud, mechanical grind. The sound tore through the sterile hum of the passing pods, a raw and discordant note in a symphony of perfect silence. It was a jagged, ugly noise, and he loved it. He felt the gears lock into place, the truck shuddering in response to his command. He was no longer just drifting in the stream, he was imposing his will upon the machine. He held the wheel with both hands, steadying himself, preparing to tear his own path through the grid. The road ahead was his, and for the first time that day, the machine obeyed only him. Elias pressed his right boot down. The floorboard groaned beneath him as the engine roared, a guttural, living sound that defied the antiseptic hum of the highway. He felt the torque rise instantly, a violent surge that pulled the truck forward and pinned him deep into the seat. Heat radiated from the transmission tunnel, stinging his shins, but he did not let up. The needle on the analog tachometer spiked, trembling as it climbed toward the red line. He leaned into the wheel, feeling the truck fight for traction against the asphalt. A slight tremor traveled up the steering column, a mechanical protest he corrected with a sharp, instinctive jerk of his wrists. He was no longer just maintaining speed, he was forcing the machine to its limit. The scent of hot oil and burnt rubber filled the cab, a sharp, metallic reminder of the friction he was creating. Outside, the blurred silver pods seemed to slow down as he surged past them, their silent, predictable paths rendered irrelevant by his raw, unbridled velocity. He felt the steering wheel vibrate in his palms, a rhythmic, pulsing connection that demanded his full attention. He was the master of the iron, the fire, and the motion. The road ahead opened up, a dark ribbon of potential, and he drove deeper into the throttle, hungry for every mile of the remaining run. The horizon broadened, revealing the true scale of the grid. Thousands of miles of asphalt stretched toward the state line, stripped of all humanity. Elias watched the delivery fleets moving in perfect, synchronized swarms. They did not drift, they did not hesitate. They occupied the lanes with mathematical precision, their sensors locked into a hive-mind calculation that rendered traffic lights and human reaction obsolete. He tracked a convoy of silver units, each maintaining exactly 3 feet of distance from the next. They moved like a single, elongated organism, flowing through the interchanges without a stutter. There was no wind resistance here, no variation in speed, and no sense of a journey being made. It was pure, sterile output. Every delivery was scheduled, every route optimized to the microsecond. As he cruised alongside the edge of this machine-controlled landscape, the sheer monotony of their perfection became suffocating. They never blinked, they never felt the road. They simply existed to fulfill the logistics mandate of a world that had forgotten the weight of the miles. Elias felt the stark divide between his own mechanical struggle and the cold, efficient light of the highway. He was moving through a graveyard of ambition, where the asphalt had been reclaimed by the logic of the algorithm, leaving no room for the pulse of a driver. A flicker of neon appeared through the haze, a jagged, buzzing light that refused to harmonize with the silent highway. It was the diner. Elias eased off the throttle, the engine note dropping from a scream to a low, guttural rumble that felt like a dying heartbeat. He banked hard, tires biting into the shoulder as he veered off the asphalt. The transition was violent. The truck bucked and shuddered, its heavy suspension groaning as it hit the loose gravel of the access road. Dust billowed up, coating the windshield in a layer of grit that the automated wipers couldn't clear. He wrestled the wheel, correcting a slide as the rear tires fought for purchase against the uneven ground. The diner stood in the center of the lot, a relic of steel and glass, isolated from the grid that pulsed just a few hundred yards away. He rolled into a spot beneath a rusted sign, the gravel crunching loudly under the weight of the tires. Elias pulled the parking brake, the metal lever clicking into place with a final echoing snap. He turned the key. The combustion shuddered once, twice, and then fell silent. The sudden absence of noise felt heavy, pressing against his ears. He sat for a moment in the quiet, listening to the metallic ticking of the cooling engine, the only sound left in a world that had forgotten the road. The door groaned on its hinges, a sound of rusted metal fighting against decades of neglect. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of stale coffee and trapped heat. Elias did not look for a seat immediately. He moved toward the back wall. It was a mosaic of memory, plastered with silver gelatin prints that had curled and yellowed at the edges. These were the faces of the Pathfinders. He traced the grain of a photo showing a driver leaning against a massive, chrome-heavy rig, hands calloused and face lined by 1,000 miles of sun. They were not just people, they were architects of the road, men and women who had measured their existence in fuel burned and horizons crossed. Their eyes looked back at him from a different century, steady and unburdened by the cold logic of the current grid. He felt a sharp, hollow ache in his chest, the recognition of a brotherhood now erased. Every face on the wall represented a life defined by choice, by the unpredictable turn of a wheel. Now, they were merely ghosts trapped behind glass. He pulled his hand away, the glass cold beneath his fingertips. The silence of the diner was no longer peaceful. It was an indictment of everything that had been discarded to achieve the perfect, sterile efficiency waiting just outside the door. Elias slid onto a vinyl stool that squeaked under his weight. He signaled for coffee, his movements deliberate and slow. Above the counter, a wall-mounted monitor flickered to life, casting a harsh, blue-white glare over the worn laminate surface. The news ticker scrolled in a rhythmic, hypnotic crawl. 0 traffic fatalities. The phrase repeated every 10 seconds, a mantra for the new world. Elias watched as the screen displayed a digital map of the regional highway, showing a swarm of silver pods moving in perfect interlocking patterns. A graphic flashed red, highlighting a single, erratic vehicle icon labeled as a manual override unit. The broadcast shifted to a segment on the transition to fully autonomous zones. Experts spoke of the human element as a variable of chaos, a glitch in an otherwise flawless system. Elias stared at his reflection in the dark coffee surface, seeing his own tired eyes staring back. The report stated that human-operated vehicles were now statistically classified as a primary threat to grid integrity. He was no longer just a man driving a truck, he was a liability, a walking error code in a machine that tolerated no mistakes. He took a sip of the coffee, letting the bitter heat ground him, and watched the news anchor celebrate the total elimination of human choice from the asphalt. He was the exception that the system was built to delete. The memory of the protests remained sharp, like grit caught in a gear. He remembered the city squares filled with people, their voices rising against the first wave of mandatory automation. They held signs, blocked intersections, and demanded the right to operate their own machines. It felt like a war for the soul of the road, but the resistance lacked stamina. The grid promised a life without delays, without the stress of navigation, and without the risks of the open lane. The convenience was an anesthetic. Slowly, the crowds thinned. The rallies became smaller, then purely symbolic, and finally, they vanished altogether. People realized they preferred the ease of being transported to the burden of driving. They traded the unpredictability of the journey for the promise of a perfect arrival. Elias watched a group of teenagers walk past the diner window, their eyes glued to flickering personal interfaces, completely indifferent to the heavy machinery idling outside. They did not care about the history of the asphalt or the weight of a steering wheel in their palms. To them, the transition was not a loss of liberty, it was a long overdue upgrade. The collective choice had been made, and the protest signs were long since buried under the foundations of the new, silent world. He was fighting a war that had been surrendered by everyone else years ago. Outside the diner, the physical world was being rewritten. Elias watched through the glass as a crew of automated drones dismantled the last remaining parking lot in the sector. The asphalt, once scarred by decades of oil leaks and tire marks, was being ripped away in perfectly measured segments. In its place, grass began to grow within hours, a synthetic green carpet unrolling over the history of the road. It was a systematic reclamation. Where trucks once idled, children now stood in designated play zones, their movements monitored by overhead sensors. The process was surgical. Elias looked down at his own hands, then toward the steering column of his truck. He remembered the era of the lockboxes, the government initiatives that mandated the removal of steering mechanisms. Thousands of steering wheels were pulled from frames, rendered into scrap metal, and melted down to create the very pods that now glided past in silence. The transition was not merely a change in technology, it was a physical purge. Every garage, every workshop, and every private shed had been audited. The tools of the driver were deemed contraband, locked away in secure storage facilities to ensure they could never be repurposed. The road was no longer a place for human agency. It was a transit corridor, stripped of its soul and sanitized for the sake of efficiency. The landscape was becoming a museum of what used to be, and he was the only exhibit left with a heartbeat. The ceramic mug clicked against the counter, a sharp, singular sound in the hollow room. Elias drained the last of the coffee. It was burnt, bitter, and tasted of a time before synthetic nutrients were the standard. He scanned the interior. Faded photographs lined the walls, depicting faces etched with the fatigue of 1,000 miles. They looked like strangers, yet he recognized every hollow stare. He pulled a worn, physical bill from his pocket. It was crisp, smelling faintly of dust and old paper, a relic that the automated scanners at the door would never recognize. He laid the currency on the laminated surface, smoothing the edges with a thumb. It was an unnecessary gesture. The diner would be empty by morning, and the money would be swept away into a waste bin by a cleaning drone that could not comprehend the value of the paper or the sentiment of the act. He pushed the bill toward the register, leaving it as a marker of his passage. A small, final anchor in a world drifting toward total digital abstraction. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor, and turned toward the exit. The diner felt like a tomb, and he was the only one left to close the heavy door behind him. He stepped toward the threshold, leaving the last remnant of his humanity on the counter. The heavy glass door swung shut, sealing the silence of the diner behind him. Outside, the sky had bruised into a deep, darkening violet. The air felt thin, stripped of the exhaust and grit that once defined the horizon. Elias walked across the cracked pavement of the lot. His boots crunched against loose gravel, the only sound in a sector designed for absolute quiet. Ahead, his truck waited. It sat like a mountain of iron in a world of smooth, synthetic pebbles. The vehicle was massive, a hulking silhouette of jagged angles and grease-stained steel that defied the sleek, rounded geometry of the nearby transit pods. He reached the driver's side door. He rested a palm against the metal. It was cold, vibrating with a faint, residual heat from the engine block. In the distance, a silver pod slid past on the magnetic rail, its lights flickering like a cold, distant star. Elias ignored the movement. He focused entirely on the weight of the handle beneath his grip. This machine was an anomaly, a relic of a time when movement required muscle and intent. He pulled the door open, the hinge groaning in protest against the stillness of the night. He climbed up, settling into the driver's seat, and felt the familiar resistance of the frame against his back. He was home. Inside the cab, the dashboard clock glowed with an amber intensity that cut through the darkness. The numbers shifted. 11:12 p.m. Elias stared at the readout. A notification pulsed beneath the time, a sharp, rhythmic blink. It was a standard protocol update from the regional logistics hub. The message was concise. At exactly midnight, the heritage zone would be decommissioned. The physical asphalt would be repurposed, integrated into the high-speed data corridors that fueled the global network. He watched the seconds tick away. To the central system, this road was merely a redundant line of code waiting for a patch. To him, it was the last artery of a dying way of life. He traced the edge of the dashboard with his fingertips, feeling the slight vibration of the idling engine. The authorities were not just closing a sector, they were erasing a memory. He looked out through the windshield at the pristine silver pods gliding silently past. They moved with a mathematical precision that left no room for error, or for him. He knew the protocol. Once the clock struck 12, the sensors would lock the perimeter, and his truck would be flagged as a static obstacle. There was no going back, and there was no detour left to take. The deadline was a physical wall, and he was staring directly at its face. Elias reached for the ignition. His fingers found the cold, grooved metal of the key. He took a breath, the air inside the cab stale and smelling of oil and old leather. Outside, the world was a vacuum of sound. The silver pods slipped by on the magnetic rail, their passage marked only by a faint, rhythmic pulse of light. They existed in a bubble of perfect efficiency, indifferent to the man sitting in the dark. Elias tightened his grip. The key resisted, a heavy, mechanical tension that felt like an argument against the future. He turned it. The starter motor whined, a desperate grinding sound that tore through the artificial serenity. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, the fuel caught. The engine roared to life, a guttural, shaking vibration that traveled up through the steering column and into his chest. It was a violent, chaotic noise. It was a scream. The dashboard lights flickered, struggling to keep pace with the surge of power. Elias felt the truck shudder as the cylinders fired, each stroke a defiant pulse against the humming, electric indifference of the world beyond his glass. The sound echoed off the diner walls, a harsh, organic intrusion into a sterile landscape. He did not look back. He kept his foot on the pedal, holding the rhythm steady, reclaiming the space with the raw, heavy weight of combustion. Elias slammed the heavy gear shift into first. The transmission groaned, a metallic protest that vibrated through the floorboards. He eased off the clutch, and the truck lurched forward, its massive frame heavy and unrefined compared to the grace of the silver pods. He pulled onto the entry ramp, the tires biting into the asphalt with a raw, grinding friction. Ahead, the interstate was a river of cold, efficient light. The pods moved at exactly 120 miles per hour, their proximity sensors locked in a synchronized, unblinking dance. Elias did not wait for an opening. He accelerated, the engine screaming as he forced the truck into the lane. The nearest pod swerved, its internal guidance system recalculating in a microsecond to compensate for his unpredictable mass. He gripped the wheel, knuckles white, fighting the heavy pull of the steering as he cut across the digital flow. Every movement was a struggle against the road's artificial geometry. He held his position, a jagged, loud anomaly in their silent, synchronized swarm. The pods adjusted, creating a vacuum around him, but he kept his foot pressed firm against the pedal. He was no longer just driving, he was obstructing the algorithm. The wind whipped against his window, carrying the smell of exhaust, a sharp contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled vacuum of the surrounding traffic. The dashboard clock glowed in a steady, rhythmic amber. It was the only thing in the cab that spoke the language of the highway. Midnight. The digital display blinked, a countdown synchronizing with the infrastructure sensors embedded in the asphalt. He had less than an hour before the pavement beneath his tires turned from a road into a data corridor. Every mile marker he passed was a door locking behind him. Elias checked the mirrors. The pods behind him remained perfectly spaced, a wall of cold, silent silver that showed no sign of yielding. He checked the fuel gauge. The needle hovered, a physical reminder of the finite nature of his defiance. The road ahead was the only space left where he could still be himself. He pressed the accelerator, the engine responding with a deep, guttural growl that defied the programmed silence of the surrounding traffic. The truck shuddered as he pushed it harder. He watched the horizon. The dark stretch of asphalt was shrinking, the light of the approaching infrastructure nodes growing brighter by the second. He gripped the steering wheel, his muscles aching from the constant, manual micro-corrections required to keep the heavy frame straight. He was not just fighting the traffic anymore, he was racing the clock, and the clock was winning. Elias reached out and flipped the master override switch, severing the link to the highway's grid. The truck jolted as the steering became entirely his own. No cruise control, no automated trajectory, just the weight of the steel and the friction of rubber on asphalt. He felt the road through the steering wheel, every tiny ripple in the pavement traveling up his arms. The truck pulled left, a slight drift caused by the uneven load, and he countered it with a firm, deliberate twist of the wheel. It was a rhythmic, physical conversation between his grip and the tires. A sudden gust of wind hit the side of the cab, rocking the frame, and his hands adjusted instantly, compensating for the sway without a second of hesitation. The vibration of the engine was no longer a background noise, but a pulse he tracked through the soles of his boots. He felt the tension in the drive shaft and the subtle resistance of the transmission. He was reading the road, calculating the turn, and holding the line with muscle and bone. The surrounding pods glided by like ghosts, but he was grounded, tethered to the reality of the asphalt. He tightened his grip, leaned into the next curve, and felt the raw, unmediated power of the machine beneath him. Elias kept his gaze fixed on the asphalt ahead, ignoring the flicker of the lane assist indicators on the surrounding pods. He held the wheel with a grip that turned his knuckles into white ridges. When the front tire hit a shallow rut, the truck tugged violently toward the shoulder. He didn't fight the pull with brute force. He danced with it, turning into the drift and snapping the wheel back to center before the vehicle could deviate an inch. The movement was fluid, precise, and entirely his own. To his left, a silver pod glided past, its trajectory locked to the millimeter by the central network, incapable of reacting to the same road imperfection. Elias felt the transmission shift through the floorboards, a heavy, rhythmic thud that signaled the engine's readiness. He adjusted his weight, leaning into the next slight curve, feeling the suspension coil and release under the pressure of his turn. He was not just following the road, he was navigating the geometry of the pavement. His pulse matched the low, guttural vibration of the combustion engine. He corrected for a crosswind, his hands shifting the wheel in a microscopic, constant oscillation that kept the heavy frame perfectly balanced. He was a human element in a system that demanded perfection, asserting his presence with every deliberate turn. The traffic thinned as the highway curved toward the horizon. Elias saw the gap ahead, a long, empty stretch where the automated pods fell back into their tightly packed formations. He slammed his foot onto the floorboard. The engine surged, a violent, guttural roar that tore through the sterile silence of the interstate. He shifted up, the mechanical grind echoing against the metal cab, drowning out the faint, high-pitched hum of the electric motors nearby. The truck surged forward, its weight pushing against the asphalt with a raw, kinetic force that the network pods could never replicate. He didn't look at the speed gauge. He felt the acceleration in the small of his back, the sudden force pinning him against the seat. Every piston fire was a hammer blow to the silence. He drove harder, pushing the needle into the red, reclaiming the road inch by inch. The world outside became a blur of motion, stripped of the digital precision that governed the rest of the highway. He was no longer part of the stream. He was a disruption, a loud, defiant heartbeat in a landscape of quiet efficiency. He held the wheel steady, listening to the engine scream, and pushed the pedal deeper until the vibration of the steel frame was the only thing that existed. The asphalt ahead grew weathered, scarred by decades of neglect and shifting soil. Elias felt the change through the tires instantly. The steering wheel grew alive in his hands, twitching with every fracture and loose stone. This was not the smooth, sterilized surface of the data corridors. This was raw, honest ground. When the front left tire dropped into a pothole, the truck lurched, sending a sharp jolt through his shoulders. He didn't compensate with a computer-assisted nudge. He braced, pulled the wheel hard against the resistance, and forced the frame back into alignment. His muscles burned with the effort, a dull ache that served as a reminder of his own physical presence. Each vibration from the road traveled up through the steering column and into his palms, a chaotic, unscripted language that only he could interpret. He felt the pull of the road, an unpredictable, shifting force that demanded constant human vigilance. There was no algorithm for this kind of terrain. He leaned into the next turn, his knuckles white against the grip, feeling the suspension groan under the strain of the uneven surface. He was not just driving, he was wrestling with the physics of the Earth itself, confirming with every correction that he was still the one in command. The delivery fleet appeared on the horizon like a singular silver ribbon. Thousands of pods moved in perfect, rhythmic lockstep, their proximity sensors maintaining a gap that never fluctuated by a single millimeter. Elias did not slow down. He aligned his truck with the center of the formation and pushed the throttle. The engine's roar hit the leading pods like a physical blow. As he surged into the heart of the swarm, the network sensors registered the anomaly. The silence of the highway shattered. The pods nearest to him jerked, their emergency algorithms triggering a frantic, collective correction. He cut hard to the left, forcing a line of pods to veer into the emergency lane to avoid a collision. He saw them through his side mirror, shaking, wobbling, their perfect synchronicity broken into a chaotic, drifting mess. He didn't look back to see them stabilize. He leaned into the curve, his tires biting into the asphalt with a screech that drowned out the hum of the electric motors. He had punched a hole in their logic, a jagged, human-shaped scar in their calculated reality. The air behind him remained turbulent, the pods struggling to re-establish their grid as he pulled clear, leaving their sterile, predictable rhythm in the dust of his wake. The highway ahead opened into a vast, empty stretch, stripped of both traffic and the sterile glow of the pods. Elias eased his grip on the wheel, but his focus sharpened. He reached down and flicked the switch that cut the remaining electronic stability assist. The truck immediately felt heavier, more demanding. Every bump in the road now traveled directly into his bones without the buffer of a computer's correction. He looked at the dashboard, the needles were steady, the heat index rising, the machinery responding to his touch alone. In this moment, the weight of the last 20 years evaporated. He realized that the machines behind him were slaves to a code they could not change. They arrived because they were programmed to arrive. He was here because he chose to be. He adjusted his seat, felt the firm resistance of the floorboard under his boot, and pressed the pedal deeper. The engine responded with a surge of raw, unrefined power that shook the very frame of the vehicle. There was no cruise control to maintain his speed, no satellite to dictate his route, and no algorithm to predict his next move. He was not a passenger of the system. He was the driver of his own trajectory, carving a path through the silence that belonged to him and him alone. The road ahead stretched toward the horizon, a ribbon of aging asphalt untainted by the sterile glow of the network. Elias felt the machine breathe beneath him. He pushed the throttle, listening to the combustion cycle deepen into a rhythmic, guttural roar that defied the silence of the surrounding plains. A sudden crosswind slammed against the side of the truck, threatening to push him toward the shoulder. In a world of automated pods, that wind would have been a variable for a sensor to process. For Elias, it was a physical demand. He braced his arms, leaned into the pull, and wrenched the wheel back to center. His muscles burned with the effort, a sharp, grounding sensation of work that the modern world had long ago traded for ease. He watched the needle climb, feeling every uneven patch of the road translate through the steering column into his palms. The air rushing through the open window tasted of dry earth and heat, not the recycled, filtered atmosphere of the pods. He realized then that the rest of the world was merely arriving, moving from point to point in a state of suspended animation. He was doing something else entirely. He was traveling. Every mile was a choice, every turn a victory, and every vibration a reminder that he was still alive. Elias slammed his boot against the floorboard, pinning the throttle. The engine pitch climbed into a high-frequency scream that had no place in the quiet, calculated world of 2084. His knuckles turned stark white as he fought the vibration, his hands locked onto the wheel with a grip that left no room for error. The dashboard erupted in a rhythmic pulse of red warning lights, signaling critical heat and mechanical strain, but he did not ease off. To the central network, he was an anomaly, a rogue data point accelerating into the forbidden zone. He felt the truck shudder, the chassis groaning under the pressure of speeds the machine was never meant to sustain. This was not just driving, this was a collision with the status quo. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, ignoring the flashing alerts, his body tense to counteract the violent pull of the road. He was the only thing on the interstate that wasn't following a protocol. He was the only thing that could decide to crash, to swerve, or to stop. In that moment of absolute reckless velocity, he became the most dangerous man on Earth, a human variable that the cold, perfect logic of the system could neither predict nor control. Elias merged into the stream of the interstate, a jagged piece of iron moving through a river of liquid silver. The pods glided alongside him, their surfaces reflecting the twilight like polished mirrors, yet not one of them adjusted its path to accommodate his presence. He was a glitch in their perfect grid. To the central network, he existed only as an unidentifiable mass of heat and noise. He watched the interior of the nearest pod as he overtook it. The passengers sat in perfect, synchronized stillness, their eyes glazed over by the glow of projected interfaces. They did not see the man behind the wheel. They did not hear the raw, guttural growl of the engine. He was a phantom, a remnant of a forgotten century drifting through a world that had erased his kind from the map. Every time he shifted lanes, the network pulsed, trying to recalculate the flow around his unpredictable trajectory. He felt the cold light of the data corridors washing over the windshield, a stark white glare that sought to sanitize the road. He gripped the wheel, his pulse steady, his gaze locked on the dark expanse ahead. He was the only thing moving with intent, a flickering soul of fire and grit in a vast, silent ocean of steel and logic. He was the last ghost in the machine. The road ahead narrowed, the silver pods falling away like discarded shells. Elias leaned into the curve, his fingers digging into the leather of the steering wheel until his palms burned. He stopped fighting the vibration. He let the truck's shuddering rhythm move through his frame, aligning his own pulse with the frantic hammering of the pistons. The rhythm was absolute. It was a heartbeat of steel and fire. Suddenly, the overhead data corridors flared, a blinding, strobe-like barrage of white light designed to force an automated stop. He didn't blink. He didn't lift his foot. He steered by the memory of the asphalt, feeling the texture of the road through the tires and the feedback in the column. The engine roared, a guttural, defiant shout against the sterile silence of the grid. He felt the torque shift as he hit the final straightaway, the truck surging forward with a raw, unrefined power that the network could never compute. He wasn't just moving across the land, he was reclaiming it, inch by inch, with every drop of fuel burned. His breathing matched the intake of the engine, deep and steady. The world blurred into a single, high-speed streak of defiance, leaving nothing behind but the scent of exhaust and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a machine that answered only to his touch. The horizon flattened. The truck crossed the invisible boundary of the heritage zone, and the road ahead transformed. The asphalt, once rough and worn, smoothed into a seamless, glowing ribbon. Elias kept his foot pressed firm, pushing the engine to its final, desperate limit. The sound was a roar that seemed to tear at the silence of the night, a singular protest against the perfection surrounding him. Then, the sensors caught him. A wave of white light swept across the interstate, flickering to life like a sudden waking eye. The data corridor was active. Rows of overhead nodes ignited in sequence, bathing the highway in a sterile, clinical glow that erased the shadows of the trees and the texture of the ground. The truck pushed forward, but the world around it had already moved on. Elias watched the tachometer needle dip, the engine heat dissipating into the cold air. The roar that had defined his journey began to thin, swallowed by the humming vibration of the grid. He passed the final marker. The lights shifted to a steady, rhythmic pulse, locking the highway into an automated lockstep. Behind him, the road was empty. The truck became a small, dark speck, then vanished into the distance, leaving no trace of the combustion or the man. The manual era had reached its end. The silence that followed was absolute. It rushed in to fill the void where the engine had been, a pressurized calm that felt heavier than the roar. The highway stretched out, perfectly smooth and devoid of any imperfection. No grit remained on the surface, no scent of fuel lingered in the air, yet the stillness felt fractured. It was a sterile, monitored quiet that lacked the chaotic rhythm of the world Elias had known. He had left no skid marks, no debris, only the sudden vacuum of his departure. For a moment, the sensors seemed to pause, as if the network itself were recalibrating to the sudden lack of resistance. The wind whistled through the overhead nodes, a thin artificial sound that mimicked the howl of the road but lacked its soul. Deep in the concrete, a faint vibration remained, a phantom pulse that defied the grid's efficiency. It was a ghost of the metal and heat, an echo of the combustion that had defied the system for one last hour. The highway was a closed loop, a masterpiece of logic, but the space where the truck had traveled remained marked by the memory of the sound. It hung in the night air, a lingering defiance that the sterile light could not penetrate, nor the automated silence erase. Inside the cabin, the stillness grew heavy. The air was cool and smelled of nothing. A single, thin beam of light from the overhead corridor cut through the windshield, illuminating the steering wheel. It sat perfectly motionless, a circle of textured material that had once channeled the pulse of the road directly into the hands of the driver. Now, there were no hands. There was no torque, no vibration, no resistance to fight against. The wheel remained tilted at an angle, frozen in the position where it had last been held. Dust motes drifted through the narrow light, settling slowly on the leather surface. Outside, the highway hummed with the sound of silent silver pods passing in the dark. They glided with mathematical precision, ignoring the stationary truck. The steering wheel was a relic of a forgotten language, a tool for a world that demanded participation. It offered no function in this new, guided reality. It simply existed as an object of silence. The light shifted, crawling slowly across the dashboard as the night progressed. The wheel stayed in shadow. The connection was broken, the journey had been refined into a destination, and the road was no longer a path to be conquered. The silence was complete.